Hey everyone, welcome to History Shop Talk. My name is Rob, and today we're going to be talking about the Shermans versus the Cats. Specifically, I posted a video a couple weeks ago about 30 Corps' performance, and there was some discussion about their performance once they crossed the Nijmegen Bridge on September 21st, and whether or not Sergeant Robinson's 4 Fireflies Shermans should have run up the road or not, and whether they could have, and what was the likelihood. And to be fair, I was kind of lazy. I threw in the 4-to-1, 5-to-1 ratios that you often hear about, only to watch a video the next day about by the chieftain, who points out that the 5-to-1 is a myth, and shattered my whole credibility. So let's take a look real quick at the video that I'm referencing. He was doing a stand-up routine at the Tank Fest activity commemorating D-Day and going through a series of different myths about American armor. And I found the video to be very good and very informative, and I agree with an awful lot in it. I think there's maybe a little room to debate on a couple things. So let's dive right in. Okay, so I'm going to focus on 4 of the myths, or 3 of the myths that he talked, myth 4, 7, and 8, which is Pershing could have come earlier, and then the Sherman stuff. The only reason I'm really talking about the myth 4 at all is because I am going to reference a book that he was talking about in this myth called Death Traps. And, he introduced the book and he says it's a great book and he highly recommends it, but then sort of proceeds to discredit it by saying the book is wrong and dismissing or saying that the reason the Pershing wasn't deployed is because General Patton didn't like them, and sort of dismissing Cooper's work as not being historical because it was, quote, a memoir, and that he didn't know where Cooper got the idea that Patton was involved in tank development. Nobody knows. Suffice it to say, it's not true. So, kind of what did Cooper really say? I'm gonna, before I answer that, I'm gonna jump to an example of how the chieftain is very influential in blogs and discussions, and you'll find all sorts of references to this video in particular. This one is another person who kind of throws up, shade on General Patton with respect to the M26. He talks about how there were people who were talking about maybe getting the Pershing as early as D-Day. Now, Nicholas, the chieftain, Nicholas Moran, never says that. So this is just a different person's opinion, but he's talking about the myth, some thinking as early as D-Day. And to put it shortly, Patton has no real influence on tank development and deployment, McNair and others did, okay? And so when you read, there's a lot of blogs out there, and they're all like, oh, this, Patton killed the Sherman or the Pershing, or Patton didn't, right? It's all a myth. It's all a myth. Okay, there are some, I think it's important that we, use words correctly. We're going to come back to the, development versus priorities as we assess Cooper's book. Okay, so pause the screen and read this. This represents, as far as I can tell, out of 333 pages, this represents basically every significant entry about Patton, and the stuff highlighted in yellow sort of addresses his views on the M4 versus the M26. According to Cooper, Patton's view was that the M26 was not favorable according to the Armed Force Doctrine. Okay, he does talk about the M4, Patton thinking the M4 was lighter and required less fuel and would be faster, more agile. Cooper confirms that it was lighter and did use less fuel, but points out that the M26 had a higher horsepower ratio and was more agile due to its wider tracks. It had better mud and off-road capabilities than the M4. Talks down here about he persisted in his view, and he insisted we should downgrade the M26 and concentrate on the M4. And he thinks that this decision was made, and that Schaeff concurred with it, passed it on to Washington, and in fact they did. He claims that there was a deprioritization. In his opinion, it was a disastrous decision that had catastrophic effects. And then later in the book, he talks about that decision again. But notice here he does talk about how Patton has an extreme flair for getting his way. So, right off the bat, a couple things come to mind. Patton didn't kill the Sherman. Patton didn't kill the Pershing. He was not the decision maker. McNair and others were. But the context of all of this portion of the narrative is important. This narrative comes in the January meeting at a place called Tidworth Downs that key leaders met, and they showed live demonstrations of basically all the weapon systems except one. The M26, they had a 8mm film, and they were showed a film of this would-be tank. And so, according to Cooper, Patton is looking at this and saying, I prefer the M4, right? He's looking at the M4. He knows he's been fighting with it since the desert. He thinks it can get the job done. And this maybe tank over here on this video, he's not so sure about. And so according to Cooper, he recommends that they deprioritize the M26 and they focus on the M4. Well, that's completely, did it happen or not? I don't know. But the initial build was 500 requests here in September, which got denied. But then in January, they scaled it back. And then, of course, later they ramped it up. My thinking is if in 43, well before the invasion, if you think you got the war-winning tank, that probably your requests are going to increase with time, not decrease. Usually, if you got the war-winning weapon, it's going up. My suspicion is if you put yourself in the shoes of the respective people. This is January. At that time, the invasion D-Day wasn't scheduled for May, so 4 months away. You have a video of a tank that's not even in Europe yet, and you're looking at trying to get on the beach here in 3.5, 4 months from now. Okay, so from the operator's point of view, Patton's point of view, focusing on what you got and making sure it's properly supplied and equipped and all that sort of stuff makes complete sense. When you're Schaeff, the Eisenhower, you're the commander, it makes sense. Why would you want to introduce a main battle tank on the beaches? This is a tank that doesn't have a dual drive capacity. It's never been tested in combat. Remember, think about the Battle of Kursk when the Germans ran the Tiger and the Panther into battle prematurely. How did that go? This is the most important operation of the war. So any concept of trying to have the purging by the D-Day date is, I think, almost ridiculous. And I don't remember what the name of the website was that was citing the D-Day. Nicholas never mentions D-Day in his, but the idea that Patton as a primary user has no influence, I think I don't buy that. I mean, commanders do. Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf went to the desert, realized that the black leather boots that Americans have been wearing for 50 years was not suitable for that heat. He wore 3 different pairs of boots for a couple of days, and he ordered 500,000 boots, and guess what? The customer does have a say, and if you then put yourself in Washington's shoes and McNair's shoes, the customer is saying, you don't have to push this troublesome tank. You've been working on this thing. It's got its bugs. It's not ready to go. It's not ready for prime time. You don't have the supply chain set up, and you've just been relieved of the burden. Your customer says they don't even want it or need it initially. It makes complete sense that this decision actually did happen, even if we can't find any specific documents. Now, maybe there's a document out there, and if you got it, I would love to see it, but I'm not aware of, I haven't been able to find a Schaeff directive to Washington saying deprioritize the M26. But I think it's totally credible. The reason this book's important is because it's first person. He's doing battle damage assessment of tanks on the battlefield throughout the European theater campaign. After I think he lands on D-Day plus 20 something or whatever. He has photographic evidence. And just sort of generally speaking, I don't think that a lieutenant down in a maintenance battalion somewhere is the source of any myth. I mean, he may have been echoing sentiments and giving his opinion about something being a disastrous decision. But again, would it have been less disastrous if we fielded the M4 on D-Day and it turned out to be a dud? So I think that's an opinion. But I do think that it's important to keep everything in perspective. This is 4 or 5 paragraphs worth of text out of 333 pages, and in other areas he is quite quite credible. So now let's pick up with the Sherman versus the cats kind of thing. This is myth 7 from the Chieftain's brief. He talks about a couple of things that sort of discredit the myth. First of all, everything is a tiger. Basically, everyone was mistaking Mark IVs for Mark VIs. He talks about the platoon structure of the American platoons being 5 tanks. So obviously, you're going to send your smallest tactical unit out on the battlefield to deal with a problem, whatever it is. I agree fully with him that this is where the specific 5-to-1 comes from. He cites Steve Zalaga, and I've since been able to dig a little deeper, and I'm confident that the numbers quoted here are coming out of the Ballistics Research Lab, 1946. But he quotes Steve as saying between D-Day and the fall of Germany, there was how many tanks Tiger 1 engagements were there? During the whole engagement, there were only 3, and then it turns out really that one of them is a Pershing engagement and one of them is Tigers on a loading dock. Sorry, that doesn't count. So there's one single engagement and between Shermans and Tigers, and the Americans won it. He talks about the Battle of Ericourt. At first I thought this is the battle he was referring to, but when you look into this battle, this is actually basically Panthers. Mainly the 75 millimeter M4s, the low velocity M4s. Shermans against the Panthers. I'm not sure what the point is. He talks about how they did it. Nicholas talks about the fact that this is more about sort of the combined arms team. The American combined arms team was better, but just because the American combined arms team killed 80 Panthers doesn't mean that the Panther was necessarily the worst of the 2 tanks. It was a better system fighting a worse system. Okay, so I think we see eye to eye on that. Where we might have a little differences. Okay, here's where we start to get into, is the 5-to-1? Did you really need 5-to-1? Like, okay, the British did a survey. The AORG did a survey in 1952, and they went through 250 engagements, tank-on-tank engagement. Well, tank-on-tank and with supporting guns and anti-tank guns and things like that, and they broke it down. We'll look at it in a minute. And basically, they came to the conclusion that whoever shoots first wins. That's a pretty good standard, and it has been for a long time. He talks about Nicholas talks about the fact that you typically don't open the engagement unless you're at a tactical advantage, and as a result, you're more calm and collected, and they're getting a significant emotional event. Okay, but when you go back up to the everything was a tiger thing, there's a little bit of a, okay, if you're calm and collected and you're watching through the binoculars, your life depends on getting it right, and vehicle recognition is a problem. Absolutely known problem, but that doesn't mean that every single person in the entire European theater from D-Day to the end necessarily can't identify a tank properly. He quotes an American estimate that Shermans were an average of 3.6 times more effective than a Panther. So this indicates that the Sherman was superior. Okay, I have not been able to get my hands on this report, and if anyone knows where this thing is, I mean, I've actually sent off to the government to get it, and I still don't have it. But multiple people cite this report, and they talk about the 3.6 times more effective. In exact contradiction, Nicholas points out that the British said they wanted a 2.2 to 1 advantage. Their study is done on a larger data set, and it's very thorough. So I'll be interested. I'm trying to get this one here. I don't know what to think of this. This defies any real logic based on first-hand testimonial and British studies that contradict it. So let's take a look at some of the other folks that try and glom on to Nicholas and say, lots and lots of forums out there reference his work, and then they apply their own statistics on top of it. Now this guy here, for the record, goes out and he talks about, Panther versus M4. The Panther had an advantage of 1.1 while on defense, but the M4 had an 8.4 to 1 while on offense. Now, I'm sorry. This is, first of all, that means that one Sherman is equivalent to 8.4 Panthers, basically. That M4 on the offense could take on 8.41 and have a 50-50 chance of living, right? I got to call BS on this, for the simple reason that the report, if the report is being accurately cited, if the M4 is on the attack, is on the offense, and has an 8.4 to 1 ratio, by definition, the Panther has to be on the defense, where he has a 1.1 to 1 advantage. So you cannot have in a M4 versus a Mark 5, a Sherman versus a Panther, where the Sherman is on offense, you cannot have both sides having the advantage. One side has the advantage. So this is just completely flawed logic. And again, I want to stress, this is not the chieftain's logic. This is, I'm not sure who the author of this is, but this is inconsistent. So I don't know if it's misquoted. I don't know if the only explanation that would explain something like this is where the 8 to 4 involved other factors, that in a Panther and Sherman engagement where the Shermans had close air support, okay, then they might have been 8.4 to 1. But in a strictly tank on tank, these two statements are absolutely contradictory, and it's an example of the kind of stuff you'll find out on the internet. So 5.5 to 1 myth, totally agree. It is a myth, and it's most likely based on the five tank structure. But just because a 5 to 1 ratio is a myth, it doesn't mean that the many to 1 is not a reality, right? Just you don't go from, 5 to 1 is a false, therefore the Sherman is a 1 to 1 compared to a Panther or a Tiger. The dismantling of 5 to 1 has nothing to do with 3 to 1 or 2 to 1 or 4 to 1, right? The question is that we're trying to answer is, what is the many to 1? How many Shermans did it take to beat the cat, whether it's a Tiger or a Panther? So we agree completely on the myth, but what happens is a lot of blogs take his video and they take that statement and then they apply war end statistics and they come up with casualty ratios that suggest that the Sherman was better. If we sort of step back and move out, let's go over and look at the Kriegsmarine. 80% of U-boats were sunk and or destroyed, and roughly 80% of their crews were killed. And guess what? The Americans and the British had lots of ships at the end, right? Does that mean that they weren't effective, machines, that submarines were not effective? Does that mean if you had a battle earlier in the war between a single submarine and a single corvette defending a convoy, does that mean that one-on-one engagement would not have resulted in sinking of some of those transports because the submarine was equal to or more capable than the corvette? Now, as the war progressed, what happened? Things changed. You had introduction of millimeter radar, huff duff, air support, all sorts of things. And so over time, the technology and the weight of numbers crushed the submarines, but that does not mean that the submarines were not A, effective, and B, in a one-on-one scenario, perhaps even superior to some of the anti-submarine ships they were up against. So coming back here, yeah, 5-to-1 may be a myth, but that doesn't mean that in any way equates to equality or superiority by the M4. So for a real quick crude timeline, the M4 gets its reputation against Mark IIIs and 4s, short barrel Mark IVs, which are winning the first part of the war, and then in the desert they introduced the Grant, and guess what? It at least has I think it's a 75 millimeter gun, and so it can at least kill a tank, but it's a piece of crap. It's a great infantry support tank, maybe. It's got two weapon systems, but it's not until the introduction of later tanks, and in particular the M4, that you start to see a tank that can take on both the Mark III and Mark IV short barrels. Unfortunately for us, the Germans were fighting the Russians, and the T-34 taught them a lesson that said you need bigger guns and in some cases better armor. So the Mark IV gets upgraded, the Mark V and Mark VI get introduced, and a little bit later on, sort of as an afterthought at first, we start introducing upgunned M70 or 76 millimeter guns, and you start to see the historical narratives associated with testimonial. People who are driving these two tanks right here are sitting there saying, yeah, we could not defeat them in one-on-one. We needed 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1, whatever it was. And then somewhere along the line, the magic number 5-to-1 comes up, and everybody's up in arms and says, oh, it's all a myth. It's like, okay, it may be a myth. 5-to-1 may be a myth, but that doesn't mean that it's that the M4 was superior. Now, unfortunately, we will never know with 100% certainty because we don't have any kind of sterile laboratory test between an M4 and a Tiger. If we did, we would have a couple of things. First of all, statistical significance and statistical relevance. The significance means that we'd have enough samples of each type of engagement. So one-on-ones, let's say we have a dozen. Let's say we have 3 of them at 2,000 meters, 3 of them at 1,500 meters, 3 at 1,000 meters, and 3 at 500 meters. And over the course of those engagements, occasionally the Sherman wins, right? Even a broken clock is right twice a day kind of thing. Okay, if we look at this little scenario here, and we're out in the middle of the Arizona desert with some captured German Tiger tanks, and we do this real sterile test, we find out that one-on-one, 25% of the time the Shermans win. Okay, well, we would need to repeat this process for all of the ratios: 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1, 5-to-1. So we're talking about needing 60 engagements. Oh, okay, so 12 is too many. Maybe we only need 50 engagements. But you need a statistically significant number of samples, and you need them to be in the correct syntax, for lack of a better term. You have to have 1-to-1 engagements that you can look at. You have to have 2-to-1 engagements. And what you find in this kind of clinical analysis is that at some point, at the 50% mark, we can see where the breakover is. Now, these numbers are obviously imaginary because we don't have them, okay? But they are somewhat consistent with the first-person testimonial information, which doesn't mean anything, right? It by itself, first-hand testimonial does not mean anything, okay? But now let's go take a look at this 2.2-to-1. Remember, the British did this survey in 1952, and they looked at 250 engagements. They evaluated 112 of them were sufficiently detailed and accurate enough to be reliable. That indicated the number of tanks, the type of tanks, who fired first, and what the results were, etc. So they were statistically relevant. So we're going to come to that in a minute, but they had enough data points to actually come reasonably close to our sterile model here, in the sense that it wasn't perfect. It wasn't 12 of each type or of each ratio, but they had a good mix of engagements, and their number came out consistent with the first-hand testimonial, with the traditional narrative. And then comes the 3.6. Okay. So what the heck? Where does this come from? This is that 1946 U.S. report. Perhaps more importantly is, where's the 8.4 on this chart? Okay. Every tanker that ever has been interviewed says there's somewhere over here that the Shermans need a 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1, 5-to-1, whatever it was, advantage. Every German tank commander who ever had a testimonial said, yeah, I was routinely fighting against 2 or 3 or 4 Sherman tanks. So all of their testimony is over here. The British testimony is over here. And the Americans is over here at 3.6, 1 to 3.6, and 1 to 8.4. Well, that's like right over here in the chart. So, okay. The problem is we don't know, I don't know how they came up with it. But with all surveys, it's problematic to understand how they're formed. So take this scenario. I'm in the lead tank, Rob's running over the hill with my platoon of 5 because that's how the structure of the platoon is. And we encounter 2 Panthers. Now we could have encountered 1, we could have encountered 4, but we encountered 2 in this scenario. Okay. Well, guess what? I have 2.5 to 1 ratio, and according to that British survey, I should win this battle, right? When we had a 2.2 to 1 advantage, the British tended to win the battles. So we should win this battle. So let's see what happens. I'm the first tank, and they both see me, and coincidentally, they both kill me. They fire at me, and my wingmen avenge my death. And now we have a scenario where the battlefield is clear. Okay? Now, if you're not careful, this is what you see. You see 1 to 2, right? If you base your analysis strictly on casualties, then you come up with a completely skewed point of view. I don't know how this ballistic laboratory did their study, and when I track it down, I'll come back and let you know. But the British did not come to this conclusion that the Sherman was 1 to 2. They came up with the conclusion that they needed that 2 to 1, or 2.2 to 1, or in this little scenario 2.5 to 1, in order to get victory on the battlefield. But you could very easily come away with the false impression when you use casualty statistics incorrectly. So, we're being asked to believe that from the entire engagement, from D-Day on, that in the entire war, there was only 1 single engagement, and we won it. Now, the only battle I could find in which fits the bill was Battle of Paderborn. I don't know if this is the one that that Zalaga referred to, but that means that every single Tiger tank involved in the Battle of the Bulge failed to engage a single American M4 in the entire Battle of the Bulge campaign, because that would make 2 battles between M4s and Tigers. And bottom line is, I just don't buy into the fact that every eyewitness, that every first-person testimony is wrong. And even if the Americans, even if they had only 1 engagement, any assessment that doesn't include the British is just fundamentally flawed. And we do have to be honest here. The Americans, when they landed at D-Day, were confronted with divisions that were equipped with Panthers and Mark IVs, not with Tigers. The British, the 21st Panzer had, and others that they would face as they moved across the northern France, had the bulk of the Tigers. The main Panzer division to engage the American forces was the Panzer Lehr, and it was equipped with Panthers and Mark IVs, not with Tigers. So is it possible? I suppose. I can't imagine a scenario where the entire Battle of the Bulge, not 1 German Tiger tank engaged a single American M4. Every division that they hit was American. So every tank that they hit was an American tank. So just, I find that hard to believe, and I find it hard to believe that everyone, every last person whose life depended on it, got it wrong when it came to vehicle identification. So I'm going to give you a 2-minute vehicle identification. Here's in the top you have the Tiger tank, down the bottom you have a Mark IV. From a long way away, you might not be able to tell the difference between that gun and that turret. Yeah, it's got a sponson box, it's got a cupola, sponson box, cupola, but it has a slack track, and this is one of the things that tankers are trained to look for. It has a slack track, overlapping road wheels, large overlapping road wheels. We're trained to look for gaps in the wheels, like little gaps right here. Are they big gaps and little gaps, right? So does this look anything like this? Forget from here up. It doesn't. It's got support wheels, it's got small road wheels. Now, from a long way away or from the front, you might mistake these tanks. If you could not see the track and all you could see was the top half of the tank, yes, you could very easily mistake the Mark IV for the Mark VI. And there are lots of studies that show mistaken vehicle identification. You might misconstrue a Panther for, here's a Tiger, here's a Panther. I think it's harder. The coupe or the turret is definitely, both from the front and the side, definitely different. I'm not as willing to buy into the idea that every Panther spotted on the battlefield was misidentified as a Tiger. I don't know if I agree with that. But if you saw the whole side, this flat plate here might be mistaken for the sideboard here, and these overlapping road wheels might be mistaken for these overlapping road wheels. So, is there going to be some misidentification here? Yes. Is there going to be, from the side, is there going to be a lot of a misidentification of Mark IVs? No. Okay. Quick. Let's put into action what you just learned. What do we know about this picture? Well, first of all, we know that this is probably fiction, right? At least on the European front. The 109s were basically knocked out of the sky and back defending Germany. But the more important thing is, the obvious thing that hits you in the face is, okay, Tiger tanks, okay, a couple of features, slack track, overlapping road wheels, clean sidewall, and just the sheer size of them, okay? Now, size, at a distance is hard to gauge, so size is not always helpful. Okay, so let's take a look now. Did you even see the other two tanks that are in there? Because first time I looked at it, I didn't even see those two tanks because I saw the Tigers. And if I was a gunner, that'd be what I was looking for. But here are the other two tanks. Almost immediately, with our 2-minute lesson, you know that the short barrel, that it's not a Tiger. This would have been a Mark IV. It has the small road wheels with the support road wheels. It also has the little bustle rack there with the spare tire right above my red dot there. This one has a long barrel, but it has the support rollers and the small road wheels. So this is going to be a Mark IV long barrel. Okay, so remember, your life as a tanker depends upon properly classifying it. If you treat a Mark IV as a Tiger, you're going to attack it differently. And while you're moving off to the flank, because you can't kill a Tiger head on, that Mark IV is engaging you and trying to kill you. If you mistake a Tiger for a Mark IV and you think I'm just going to charge in and blow it away, you're going up against an 88 millimeter gun and 4 inches of armor. There was incentive to know what tank you were fighting against. And despite that, sometimes, even frequently, there will be mistaken identities. Now, I bring this, I talk about firsthand testimonial. It's important. And when we dismiss it completely, as in 100%, which is what Zalaga and the U.S. reporter are asking us to do, we do so at our own peril. I highlight some of the things. This is a video that you can go look up, and at 4 minutes and 15 seconds in this Scorched Earth video, they start to read a series of firsthand testimonials from British crews that are engaged. Okay, I bring this one up not because of the 5-to-1, although that coincidentally is there, but he's talking about 5 tanks engaging from between 150 yards where his tank was, and the rest were 200 to 600 yards. Okay, at 200 to 600 yards, you are not going to mistake a Mark IV or a Panther for being a Tiger, because you're going to have, each of you is going to have a slightly different aspect angle, to look at the flank or the head on or the, whatever. And a Mark IV, if you're hitting it, a Mark IV is going to be killed, and a Tiger won't. And so there's compounding information here that shows that this is a valid testimony of an engagement with tigers, and the fact that these things were hard to kill. That's plain and simple. They were hard to kill. Now, I'm not going to go too heavily into the German testimonials, and this isn't really a testimonial from Michael Whitman, but because he's dead. But one thing that's very important to understand is, doctrinally, the Germans viewed tank on tank as the reason that the Panthers and the Tigers were developed was to offset the number of tanks, was to go kill tanks. And so this is, here's an example where he took on a regiment. In a single tank, he took on a regiment. He was in a group of 4 or 6, I can't remember. But he basically peels off and runs down a line against a single tank and proceeds into town. And he was given 17 confirmed kills. Now, these were almost certainly Cromwell's. So this isn't, the point is the psychology and the doctrine of the German tank commander, Tiger tank commander, and Panther tank commander was to attack tanks, and they knew they had the superior tank, and so they were prepared to do just this kind of thing. He was later killed by M4s, Shermans, but they were Fireflies. They were upgraded Fireflies, and they were flank shots. They basically drove right down a gauntlet and got lit up on the flank, where even a 75 millimeter M4 could have defeated him in that particular tactical situation. So now let's go take a quick look at that study, the British study. The reason this one's important is, first of all, is the quantity of the information. It was statistically significant. You can see that it breaks down the Allied 75 millimeter and 17 pounder M4s versus the Mark 6s, the Mark 5s, a mixed bag, and then against all types. And it shows the different averages. Okay. It also shows the scenarios where the Germans were successful, because if they shot first, they tended to succeed, and that was one of the takeaways from this report. Okay. Down at the bottom there, I point out 49 evaluations is vastly better than a single one for any kind of analysis. Now, the American report, I've seen 2 different numbers. I've seen that it had 90-some engagements, and I've seen it had that it classified 30 of them. So I don't know if that's kind of like here where we had 250 and they thought that 112 of them were good. Was it 90 that they had and that 30 of them were good? Or I'm not sure, because I don't have that one to look at. But the British are saying right here, ratio of Allied tanks for Allied success is 2-to-1. They have to have more tanks. They have to have more Shermans. And they had a higher proportion of 76 millimeter, 17 pounder Fireflies than the United States did, at least early on. Okay, this thing here, one of the things that's important to understand is part of the reason they were successful is because they had a 4-to-1 superiority in battle, in theater, and as a consequence, they typically had between 2-to-1 and 4-to-1 advantage. So they always were in, for the most part, all of their engagements were in the 2-to-1, 4-to-1 zone, which meant that they were going to win more of the engagements. If we go back one page, when they had more, when they had at least 2.1, 2.7, 1.9, when they had 2-to-1, 3-to-1 odds, they tended to win. And that is confirmed by the fact that typically they did have 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1 odds, and their overall success rate was 2.5. And remember, we talked about statistical relevance. They break out engagements where there were self-propelled guns and anti-tank guns. They break out tank on tank, and that's the key. When we go back to the sort of the theoretical study that I suggested, where it was pure tank on pure tank, right? They actually have a good number of pure tank on tank engagements that aren't being skewed by the supporting arms. And then they give you the ratios for those scenarios as well. Okay, now before we leave this page, it's also important to understand the scale of economies, so to speak. Notice that when an average of 11 tanks were successful when opposed by 5, okay, whereas they were not successful when it was 3 on 2. So what they're saying here is that the closer you got to a 1-to-1 fight, the fewer tanks that were on the battlefield, that simply having a slight advantage was not good enough. You know, when there's all sorts of tanks on the battlefield and there's lots of bullets flying around, they had slightly better odds, the Allies did, because they had more bullets flying at the Germans than the Germans had flying at them. And so if we talk about this last thing here, it talks in this thing, more than 2 Allied tanks were required for success against each enemy tank. This is a very definitive, clear-cut statement. So when we talk about 5-to-1, 5-to-1 might not have been valid, but remember, these statistics include Pershing engagements. Well, presumably if you were going up against Tigers, you might want a little bit higher, like maybe 3-to-1 going against Tigers, okay? The point is, this is a very thorough study that says that all those first-hand testimonials that are saying you needed 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1, they weren't lying. They weren't wrong. Okay, and so the American survey, we got to start going back and looking at that, and I'm going to do a video on that one in particular when I find it, because it just doesn't stand up to muster in, based on what we can see from first-hand testimonial and British analysis. Okay, he talks about, I include the death trap one here just because when we're sort of talking about the issue of 5-to-1, it always gets into, well, which is the better tank and, blah, blah, which one's, more survivable, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so let's take a look at this. He points out some of the things that, well, everything's not as it first appears. When you take the 2 inches of armor on a Sherman, slope it at 45 degrees, it has the equivalency of 3.6 inches. And, the relatively flat face of the Tigers had 4 inches and 4.3 respectively. I'm like, okay, I still want the 4. I still want the 4.3. I mean, that's almost a whole inch more. And then he talks about casualty rates, and he does a good job, in my opinion, of sort of pointing out, this is one of the problems with using end-of-war kind of aggregated statistics. Well, infantry is 18% and armor is 3%. Well, let's take a look at this 18.5%. He goes on to point that, one of the infantry divisions that was a leading, frontline division suffered 700% casualties. Okay, so there's infantry divisions that were never in battle, and guess what? They got counted in terms of their casualties, 0%. But the 4th ID had to get replaced 7 times over. Okay, U.S. Armor suffered 3%. Like, okay, so theoretically that's apples to apples, right? 18% to whatever. Well, if you take this ratio and into 700%, and you take this into 700%, yeah. The point is these ratios aren't necessarily reality for troops in contact, so to speak. This doesn't include officers. Not every tank had an officer, so that would be a relatively small number. This doesn't include infantry soldiers and other branch soldiers who were basically hijacked and trained in theater and put into tanks. This is the people that were sent over as qualified tankers from the United States. So we're going to take a look real quick. Now I'm going to throw out here just sort of, what I see is kind of the tank peerage. And, I kind of put this in your life depends on this. You make the choice. Okay. Down here at the bottom, I think you could safely make the choice of a Sherman 75 against a Mark IV short barrel and be pretty confident. If you look at Africa and Sicily, there was enough evidence that the Sherman was at least a peer and in some ways superior. I think that's a 1-to-1. This is my opinions based upon what I've been reading and studying, right? As you go up the stack, a Firefly is probably, pretty close to 1-to-1 against a Panther, because it has a similar gun, but it's not quite there. It doesn't have the same armor, and so you probably would want a 2-to-1, in my opinion. And then well, what do you need for a Tiger tank? Okay, we'll leave that open. Is it 5-to-1? No, probably not. Is it 1-to-1? No, it's not. So if we then start to step up the ladder here, probably if you're in that 75 millimeter and you're going up against that Panther, you're wanting that 2.2-to-1 that the British claimed they needed, and preferably 3-to-1. If you're in the Firefly going up against the Tiger, you're probably looking for 2-to-1, 3-to-1. It's funny. Nicholas mentions the scene in Fury where the Tiger engages 4 Shermans. Well, if you look at that video real quickly, of course, the first shot, the engagement opens with one Sherman being destroyed. So really what you're talking about is a 3-on-1 engagement, right? There's only 3 tankers that even knew that they were in a fight. The 4th tanker was dead before anything happened. And 2 of those tanks were 75 millimeter tanks. And so he talks about sitting back and plinking with the 76s. The problem is 2 of those tanks were actually 75s if you look closely at the film. But that represented a 3-on-1 engagement with 2 M4s at 75 millimeter and one 76 millimeter gun. And of course, Fury lives to tell the tale, because otherwise the movie would have ended. So the question though is, if we kind of step back now from the Sherman on Tiger and look at the Panther, it's supposed to be 1-to-1, right? That's what a lot of people are nowadays are claiming. Okay, because it had this 76 millimeter gun that could kill a Panther through its frontal armor. Okay, and this is where that Death Traps book comes into play a little bit. This is a photo taken of a Mark V fired on the front slope of 76 millimeter gun by a 76 millimeter gun twice, and that's not what killed it. It was another round that killed it. And one of the reasons for that is what we're going to talk about in a minute, is the way the armor is set up. Now, the one tank that we haven't talked about really in this slide was the upgraded Mark IV. Probably I'm thinking this is a 1-to-1, 2-to-1 kind of thing, even with the Firefly. The Mark IV had pretty good frontal armor, and the guns were comparable. Maybe that's the 1-to-1. The Mark IV, or the M4 Sherman 75 millimeter, you're probably wanting more than one, and I'm going to provide some first-hand testimonial in a moment that talks about Mark IVs and their frontal armor. So we're going to come back to that in just a second. Just throw the Pershing up there. Cooper points out that even though this gun wasn't the best gun on the battlefield, it was the best Allied gun, and that the tank overall was the most competitive of the Allied tanks. Okay, so let's kind of take a look now at statistics, those casualty statistics. So is the Sherman a death trap? And okay, we pointed out here that the leading tank units had 700% casualties, and the armor was only 3. I totally agree with Nicholas. I don't want to be a grunt, man. I mean, any way you slice it, I don't want to be a grunt. But if you come over here and take Cooper, who was a maintenance guy, his job was to go onto the battlefield and decide which tanks could be salvaged and not. So he's seeing the consequences of this, and he's in the maintenance where he's recording how many tanks are salvaged and how many are destroyed and how many can be recovered, etc. They entered with 332 tanks. 648 were totally destroyed. 700 were knocked out and put back into loss, and 580% casualty rate. Forget the knockdown and put in a loss. The 648, that's, a 200-300% casualty rate. Okay, this is, 600%. This is approaching the levels of the infantrymen in a leading 3rd Armored, division. Okay, so the 3%, I don't know how we can evaluate that. I don't know how we can review that, but you got to know what goes into the numbers to know what to believe. Okay. The other thing that comes out of his discussion that sort of affects this 3% is, he talks about the fact that they take raw recruits off the boat. Okay, they came over as infantrymen and they train them. And you say, well, you can't train them. Well, I can tell you from firsthand experience in an M60 tank, M60A1 tank, which is kind of a follow-on from the M48 and from the M26. You can teach me to load. They taught my entire platoon of 20-some people how to be a loader in one day. We sat in class in the morning where they talked about the different ammo types, and then they put us in a tank simulator or in a tank, and we practiced loading. In the afternoon or the next day, we came out and they gave us driver instructions, how to start it, how to use the controls, etc. And then we spent the afternoon learning how to drive. And then we spent a couple extra days driving day and night. But the point is, you can train a gunner, an assistant gunner, and a loader pretty readily. A driver, an assistant driver, and a loader pretty readily. A gunner and a tank commander are different stories. They require a little bit more skill. Okay, so just sort of coming back to this point here of, okay, is the Sherman, well, it's not as bad as it looks because it's 2 inches of armor is sloped and it's okay. Again, do you want 3.6 inches of simulated armor in front of you, or do you want 4.3 inches of actual armor in front of you? Okay, I'll leave that to you. But we got to remember that when we're talking about the Panther, guess what? It had 3.5 inches of outright armor, and it was sloped at 38 degrees. And Cooper specifically talks about the Ordnance Bureau training that he received, specifically says that 38 degrees is the magic number for ricocheting rounds. Okay, and that's consistent with the two photos you saw. The photo with the 2 rounds that hit the front slope. Those were direct hits by a 76 millimeter, and they just bounced off. And it was some other shot that killed it. So now I did just a rough estimate because I couldn't find the official equivalent thickness. But if you do a 38 to 45 ratio, to get roughly right, it comes out to be, to account for the lesser slope, you end up with about 5.32. Now, whether that's the exact number, the point is, a 3.5 inches at 38 degrees is more effective than 3.5 at 0 degrees, straight up and down. This is a pretty effective armor system, okay? So, what does this mean? Now let's come back to that scorched earth thing and look at the other testimony. This is talking about how the rounds just bounced off. All of these engagements, we're talking about 75 millimeter and 76, they didn't have the penetrating power. They bounced off. These are armored piercing shells bouncing off. 5 or 6 hits, they glanced off. You could see them ricocheting 200 or 300. This is firsthand testimonial. And whether this was a Tiger or whether this is a Panther is almost irrelevant. In some cases, they specifically say what type. The point is, our guns were being witnessed to bounce off the enemy as if they, just being shrugged off. And this isn't a mistaken identity, right? Maybe they got the tank wrong, but watching their round hit the tank and ricochet, that's not an issue of vehicle identification. So I just don't accept the general thesis that everything that was witnessed firsthand is wrong. Now, again, back in the pick a tank your life depends on it category here. One of the things that Cooper points out is the muzzle velocity is squared. The projectile energy is, what is it, mass times velocity squared or whatever for energy. That the projectile penetration capability varies with the square. So that means even a slight improvement in speed isn't just a slight improvement. It can be a significant improvement. And if you look at the guns, roughly 1,500 for the baseline, 3,000 for here. So 1,500 and 2,600 for the Firefly, 3,000, 33, 3,100. This is consistent with all the firsthand testimony that says their tanks penetrated, ours struggled. Physics, when physics and surveys and firsthand testimonial match up, I kind of believe them. And it also goes back, if you look at the Mark IV short barrel, surprise, surprise, at 1,500 millimeters, 1,500 feet per second, the Sherman is going to be competitive, especially with its 45-degree armor. Okay. Again, the Pershing up here, 2,800 foot. The only reason to have this is Cooper says that this was not as good as the other tanks, but it was adequate, that it was actually could do the job. It penetrated when it fired. So somewhere between 2,650 and 2,850, you go from maybe to pretty confident that you're going to penetrate. Okay, now remember that lowly Mark IV? This is the guy. First, this is a video, so you can watch a live human being tell you about his impressions of the Mark IV, the lowly Mark IV. Okay, we were hoping we didn't have to have a head-on. And right here, if you hit them head-on, it was a waste of your ammunition. We had to get them from the side. And he then goes on to describe how they would use tactics in lieu of superior guns and superior armor. They would use tactics to engage. One would draw the attention of the tank and the other would get on a flank, and then they would engage with the flank. Everything that we've seen up until this point, except for this U.S. Ballistics 1946 report, everything confirms that the M4 was inferior. That is not a myth.